I want to get started just because I really want to have some audience interaction because I can tell how smart you all are, and I know we've got at least one really good question from the back row brewing. I'm Terry Watt, and I'm a planner, and I'm so glad you chose this panel instead of the one that everybody wanted to be in this morning, wildfire and what we do about it. And I guarantee we'll touch on that topic. Raise your hands if you think that California's land use policies in practice today are beneficial to people, wildlife, nature, and the planet. Aww. Really? You think we're on track? No. We'll be back to you two, the troublemakers. Did somebody raise their hand over? All right, okay, well, we're gonna bring you into the conversation later. All right, well, I think we have our slides almost ready to boot up. So let me introduce the illustrious panel. And I just wanna say that, as you all know, those of you who are getting your master's degrees and aspiring to law school, this is a topic where the five of us really need you for about 5 or 6 days. So in a minute, those doors are gonna shut and lock. I'm kidding. On my panel today, I have some of the most amazing minds trying to crack the code of how we do a better job of planning with nature, for nature, so we can all survive the ride a few more years. So let me just introduce my panel. Liz O'Donoghue is the Director of Resilient Communities in the Climate Program at the Nature Conservancy. But I'm going to tell you something about Liz that's not in her bio. Liz is every day, probably outside of her hours, watching content that is all over the place, as you know, and could be overwhelming, and often deports the most salient notes and takeaways I've ever seen, as we all strive to do a better job of planning for people, wildlife, and the planet. Zach Zubin is the Associate Research Director of the Turner Center for Housing and Innovation at the University of California at Berkeley. And Zach actually practices what he preaches. He took the train last night, stayed overnight, and walked here.
Here.
In addition, how many of you all did that? No cars?
Well, not last night.
Oh, right. In addition to that, Zach is not only just an incredibly brilliant researcher, very thoughtful about research, he is going to keep us from duping you all about solutions that might or might not actually hit the mark. It's your new role, Zach. Is the policy going to dupe us? All right, Richard Taylor. He's the managing partner of Shute Mahali and Weinberger, a law firm we could not live without. But he also, as the managing partner of Shute Mahali, he is the city attorney for Saratoga, putting him on the front lines of what is now sort of clash between necessary land uses, right? Housing, clean energy, conservation and nature, and things like agriculture and wildlife connectivity. So Richard is the master at creative solutions, and I'm going to put him on the same committee as Zach. They're going to each be given after this little bullshit buttons, and we're going to send them our policies, and we're going to know if they hit that red bullshit button, and then we'll drop it. Natalie, I love Natalie's face. All right, Natalie Kuffel. All right, well, Natalie is a brilliant attorney. See, you're aspiring to maybe the right track, but we'll talk. And I I've been just blessed to work with her on and off in her role at OPR. But OPR is now. Does anyone know what OPR is now? Jordan.
On the screen.
Yeah.
Don't look at the screen.
It's the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation.
Yes, otherwise known as Lucy.
No, actually it's LCI. They changed it on us.
Oh. All right, well, I'm going to call it Lucy because who needs that, whatever, you. Okay. And she is the Deputy Director of Planning and Climate Policy at Lucy. And she's on the front lines of trying to help us figure out what policy levers could make a difference. And she's gonna be our end speaker. I want to get to their presentations because if we are going to end up with a, in practical terms, an approach policy and funding to things that are regenerative, which makes me think about Girl Scouts. Did we leave the place better than we found it? For people, for nature, and for wildlife. Regenerative communities, regenerative planning, regenerative land use. So let's dive in, and we're going to kick this off with Liz O'Donoghue. Oh yeah, she just
that to be for, how's this? Can you guys hear me? For Terry, because Terry gave us all such a great introduction, but Terry, I call affectionately a connecting Tasmanian devil. Running around, doing all sorts of things and connecting people and ideas, and it's really, she's really awesome. So, okay, so hi, I'm Liz O'Donoghue, and I work at the Nature Conservancy. And for those of you who may not know the Nature Conservancy, we've been around for over 60 years, including about 50 years in California. And our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And I say that just to give you a sense of why we're in this idea of trying to curb sprawl. So one of the biggest threats to our mission is urban sprawl. The outward creep of cities, suburbs, and exurbs is the leading cause of habitat loss in California and the United States. Generations of government policies, economic and housing incentives, cultural drivers, and more recently, the housing affordability crisis and the trend towards remote work have encouraged this outward expansion of cities and suburbs into the wildlands. The negative environmental impacts, as this audience will particularly know, are well documented. Habitat loss and fragmentation, wildlife impacts, pollution, and farmland loss pose both direct and indirect negative impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But sprawl, in addition to being bad for other goals like human health and fiscal health, it's really bad for our climate. For one, people drive more. They need their cars and they drive farther, increasing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, all of which increase greenhouse gas emissions. Homes and sprawl developments tend to require more energy and water, increasing emissions and stressing our water supply. And when that land is converted, we lose the ability of that natural land to sequester carbon, changing habitats like forests, grasslands, and wetlands into impermeable surfaces such as asphalt and concrete. So it's actually a pretty insidious loop. We convert the habitat through the sprawl, but then we lose the ability of that habitat to help us with climate change. So we have our work cut out for us. Beginning in the 50s and accelerating through today, California is a leader in the West in natural land loss to sprawl. In the last 20 years, California has lost over 1 million acres of natural areas, which is roughly equivalent to losing a Sonoma County to urban sprawl. And yet, despite the fact that we're paving over paradise here, we are no way in keeping pace with the housing need in the state. According to the state's housing plan, we need 2.5 million homes to satisfy the goal of a home for every Californian by 2030. This is a huge number, twice as many homes that were required in the prior cycle. The need is most critical for those who are disproportionately lower income and people of color who have had the housing market stacked against them for generations through practices like redlining and mortgage discrimination. So the decades of outward expansion of growth has actually not solved the housing crisis. And in fact, it's made it worse. To add insult to injury, the sprawl pattern of housing development has put people in harm's way in the path of climate risks, wildfires, flooding, and storm intensity. About 43% of Californians live in high wildfire zones or in floodplains. And the climate whiplash cycle of drought, wildfires, flooding, and intense storms will continue, exposing those millions of Californians to hardship and devastation. And the devastating fires in LA is another sign of our normal. So California has recognized the negative impacts of sprawls for decades, from the 1978 Environmental Goals and Policy Report to multiple natural communities conservation plans being adopted in the mid-1990s, to the state planning principles adopted by statute in 2002, to the state's efforts to protect 30% of California's lands and waters by 2030. Dozens of policies have been adopted to disincentivize sprawl for various reasons, to meet our climate goals, to promote fiscal health, support biodiversity in agriculture, and ensure equitable access to nature. And two of those laws, SB 375 and 743, focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from VMT, different approaches but a common goal. These policies build on and support each other. In addition to 375 and 743, and recent laws to encourage infill housing, the statewide housing plan recognizes that what kind of housing, at what density, and where is critically important. It lays out a proposed shift, identifying priorities for safe, secure, and climate-smart housing, meaning infill development in existing communities and away from high climate risk areas, close to jobs and resources, less driving, less stress and fewer costs, and siting new homes in places that also support California's iconic open spaces and biodiversity. So we see the policies to contain sprawl and focus growth in existing communities in housing policies, transportation policies, environmental and health policies. And while we've seen an impact, it really is nowhere near where we need to be. This is really hard stuff. It kind of goes to the central part of who we are as Californians. But that's why over the last few years, TNC has been exploring whether and how conservation can help curb sprawl and support the goals expressed in the statewide housing plan. We've been working to develop the evidence base and models on how conservation can help reduce VMT. Call it curiosity or call it opportunism, but if conservation is adopted as a tool to reduce sprawl and help cities and counties achieve their climate goals, we could drive funding to conservation and achieve our collective goals. So we began working on an approach, essentially flipping the planning paradigm, where conservation could provide the starting point for community design on par with other goals. We call this the integrated planning approach, and that is about integrating conservation into the planning process as a central or primary strategy and not as an afterthought. We modeled this idea in Merced County as TNC was working with the county and the Department of Conservation on another project. We developed and compared 4 different scenarios, including a business as usual scenario called recent trends, a dense and dispersed scenario where you place housing on large lots but far away from centers, the adopted scenario, which is a typical planning approach, and then the integrated planning scenario that protected natural resources as an important foundation and allocated the housing and other growth using typical compact growth principles. So this is what the integrated scenario, planning scenario looked like on a map. It shows important natural working lands along with the placement of new housing units in existing communities. We used the same future growth totals used in other scenarios, but tested infill policies to avoid developing new housing and jobs on valuable natural working lands. We analyzed the scenarios through 2 planning tools called Urban Footprint and Envision Tomorrow, and we found that both models showed that the integrated planning approach outperformed the other scenarios in almost all the stated goals. And importantly, vehicle miles traveled was reduced significantly over business as usual, with 2,000 fewer vehicle miles traveled per household annually. In addition to that, more was achieved. It also reported the lowest household costs, the fewest greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, the lowest energy and water use, and the highest transit and active transportation use. We found that planning with natural and working lands as a foundation, combined with smart growth planning principles, can lead to better outcomes, including reducing vehicle miles traveled. But this was a theoretical desktop exercise. We were interested in working with the local government for on-the-ground impact, and that's where SB 743, or the VMT mitigation law, offered us an opportunity to do just that. Our partners at the Regional Conservation Authority, who manage the Western Riverside Multi-Species Habitat Conservation Plan, asked us if we wanted to work with them to advance conservation as a VMT mitigation measure. They manage a very large habitat plan with ambitious conservation goals in a rapidly developing and increasingly expensive area. They need to diversify their funding sources to stay on pace with their goals. The RCA is, very interestingly, an arm of the Riverside County Transportation Commission, which I don't think really exists anywhere else in the state where you have a habitat agency embedded in a transportation agency. And their geography overlaps the Western Riverside Council of Governments. That Council of Governments is developing a VMT mitigation program, and the Regional Conservation Agency wanted to be a part of it. Could we and would we help them? What do you think I said? Of course. And WRCOG, interestingly, because everybody's embedded with each other, said, if you can figure out, we'll do it. So here we had an opportunity to actually test this out on the ground beyond a desktop exercise. So we joined with Fair & Peers, the leading consultancy on VMT mitigation, who also had a mission interest in this project and who brought their own resources to bear too, to help do the science and develop the framework. So here's the concept. A developer or transportation agency has a project that increases VMT per capita, and they may be required to mitigate for that increase depending on the threshold of significance. The project purchases VMT credits through a program, in this case, WRCOG's program, kind of a storefront of sorts. A transit agency, housing agency, or habitat agency creates credits through VMT reducing projects and offers those projects through the storefront that WRCOG manages. In addition to transit passes, bike lanes, work from home programs, we simply want conservation to be in that storefront. So with that concept in mind, we got to work. The guiding research question was, can we reduce VMT by conserving land in high VMT areas? And our approach was to identify conservation priority lands that overlapped with high VMT areas. So if you live in an area that you have to drive a lot, that's considered high VMT. If you live in a downtown where you usually walk or bike, that's low VMT. Conserving those parcels will retire the development rights forever, and those high VMT lands would never be able to produce VMT. If future development is placed in a more VMT efficient area, those credits can be produced. First, we needed to identify candidate parcels to study. So here you'll see in light green the high VMT areas. And that was modeled through WRCOG in these models. And in the gray hatches, these little gray, light gray boxes, those are the RCA's conservation priorities called criteria cells, and they need to preserve those to conserve biodiversity. So we started there with that overlap. Where do the criteria cells overlap with high VMT areas? But we applied other criteria to narrow down the candidates, like zoning, likelihood of development, and conservation status. And we landed on 9 parcel clusters representing different sizes, zoning densities, and locations, such as in jurisdictions or unincorporated areas, to give us a sense of if a model could reflect all of these, that diversity of situation. So here are our results. It showed that there was a wide range of net annual reduction of VMT in the 9 cluster parcels, as wide as 300,000 to 31 million VMT reduced annually, with the annual VMT reduction at 80,000 vehicle miles traveled per acre. Is that a lot? Yeah, it is. And it can be priced. The highest VMT reduction makes sense. It was on one of the larger parcels with higher potential density that would be retired, and also in an unincorporated area. So WRCOG is expected to finish their program design and seek board approval this spring. If all goes well, the program could launch after that. Once launched, the RCA will identify parcels to conserve, generate, and price credits to go into the storefront. If those credits are purchased, the funding will go back to the RCA to invest in another conservation project, making headway towards their habitat conservation goals. So we hope that this can be a model that can be replicated elsewhere in California as the state develops its VMT mitigation bank in other regions, particularly those with habitat agencies, develop VMT mitigation programs where conserving our lands and waters also help regions curb sprawl and address climate goals. This is how we can make headway in establishing conservation as a fundamental part of our land use and climate goals, not just as an afterthought. Thank you.
Okay, Liz, while you're still at the podium, I'm going to interrupt with your questions. I just want to have it on everyone's minds before Zach. So flipping the paradigm reminds me of design with nature, what I was raised on as a young planner. And I love it, using nature basically as a foundation for planning. I'm curious, how would that correlate or overlap with high danger areas, high hazard areas?
Yeah.
Since that wasn't in your checklist of co-benefits.
Yeah. Well, it might be okay, but I might go to that. So we've done some research. The Nature Conservancy worked with the Alliance for Housing and Climate Solutions and California NIMBY a couple years ago in developing legislation called AB 68, where we incentivized, the bill would have incentivized infill development and disincentivized additional density in the high biodiverse and climate risk areas. And so we did some science to map that. And what's very interesting is that the high biodiversity areas had a pretty close connection with the high climate risk areas. And so where there's high wildfire risk, high flooding risk, high coastal resources, that's also where the biodiversity, it's not a direct overlap, but you can meet, 70% of your goals or so. And so given where we are today, and by the way, that legislation hit a brick wall, okay? It was just too ambitious, but you could see how we can meet our climate goals and we can meet our housing goals, because that was really important. We need to incentivize housing in existing communities. We are not against housing. We need housing. It is fundamental to who we are, especially at the affordable level. But we also need to do it in a way that does not destroy the lands and waters and the biodiversity that keeps our state so healthy from an ecological perspective and provides the things we need to survive. So given that we have these risks that are hitting us in the face and providing so much hardship, we're just on the heel, we're still in it in LA. Can we start to drive, let's not put more housing in harm's way. Let's not expose people to these horrendous, devastating experiences. And if we can do that, at least as a foundation, then we are saving the state money, we're saving hardship and despair, we are supporting biodiversity, and we're protecting our lands and waters. I think it is still really hard because there are a lot of forces against that, but I think that's where we really need to go.
Thank you. Zach?
All right. Here. Okay, good. All right, gotta lower the microphone quite a bit here. So I'm Zach Subin. I'm the Associate Research Director at the Berkeley Turner Center, leading our climate and housing policy research initiative. And we have three components of our initiative. The first is reducing carbon pollution with new housing. The second is equitably retrofitting our existing housing stock. And the third is, as we were just talking about a little bit, protecting or supporting housing systems as they face the impacts from climate change. So in this presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about the first of these. So as Liz was starting to describe, housing policy is one of the biggest influences of overall carbon emissions. In fact, according to our analysis of UC Berkeley data collected by Chris Jones and Dan Kamen, more than half of carbon pollution from the average US household is attributable to transportation or building emissions that are influenced by housing policy. So, the biggest chunk of that is driving, both vehicle fuel and manufacturing. There's also energy and water and materials in the building that you're living in. This chart actually doesn't have land carbon. So consumption of natural land for development would actually be additional. So yeah, often you just hear about that dark blue bar of vehicle fuel, and there you often only hear about direct tailpipe emissions rather than the upstream emissions in the petroleum system. You have to keep in mind all of these things tend to be correlated. Dense, compact development has much lower rates of driving, and it typically has lower emissions in the other categories as well. But in terms of data, what I'm going to be showing you in subsequent slides is really just a function of how much people are driving. So I think everyone here has some sense of what we were just talking about, that people in living in cities drive a lot less than people living in outlying suburbs. But I want you to think about this less as a binary of sort of like, downtown next to a transit station versus, car-dependent suburb, and more of a spectrum. And we can see that spectrum in the Bay Area. So we did a case study last year. Think of sort of like a transect of 4 different Bay Area cities going from San Francisco to Oakley. So the Bay Area average vehicle miles traveled was 21 per person per day. And that basically matches Hayward, a kind of inner East Bay suburb. Palo Alto is actually closer to San Francisco as a whole than it is to the Bay Area average. And then a more outlying suburb in the outskirts of the 9-county Bay Area is Oakley at 30 VMT per person per day. So that's a factor of 3 savings that you have in San Francisco every time you build a house in SF, rather than adding a new development at the suburban fringe. And this is not just a function of remote work or people in SF not leaving their house. They're accomplishing very similar trips every day. They're just doing it. They're sometimes getting to walk and bike, or traveling shorter distances to where they're going. And you can see if you go to the commentary that we published last year, you can kind of tease apart the different factors that explain why people are driving more in these different cities. Actually, just one final point there. Another study that we published last fall looked at the potential to reduce carbon pollution with new housing by state nationwide. And one thing that we found was in each state there are examples of neighborhoods where people drive a lot less than average, and these areas tend to not be built up very intensely. So on this map, you can look at that sort of, right between the darker and the lighter blue, like the North Berkeley or the SF West Side or most of the peninsula. These are areas that are mostly single family homes, but they're still like in the 90th percentile of how much people need to drive on a daily basis compared to the rest of the state. So that's sort of this is going to be a bit of a hope sandwich. So that's that we'll talk about the potential, and then at the end we'll talk about some successes we've been seeing, and now we're going to talk about a report card of how we've been doing. So we wanted to ask this question: looking historically, can we see any evidence that our policies, our intentions are working to slow down sprawl? So what we've done is this is pre-published work that I'm presenting. We analyzed current VMT patterns as they overlay with historical housing development patterns. So we're not going back in time to look at how much people are driving. We don't have great data on that. We're looking at how much people are driving today versus how much housing was built in those neighborhoods over time. And you can use that to come up with an average VMT of these sort of different cohorts of housing development. And we did this at the census tract scale, which is basically a neighborhood scale nationwide. And you can see in the line chart a pretty consistent story, both in California and the U.S. as a whole. So pre-1940, you have a mix of urban and rural, a little bit of a different balance between the U.S. and California that isn't that important. And then in both geographies, you see it ramping up into the 70s and 80s of kind of peak suburban build out. And then in the last 10 years, this data set ends in 2019. In the final decade, you actually see a dip back down of the average VMT for new housing. So that seems like good news. So is it good news? Well, let's take one level deeper and look at more of a distribution as opposed to just the average. So now instead of the average, I'm showing you quintiles. So imagine across the whole U.S., dividing the population into fifths based on how much they drive or how much at a neighborhood average they drive. So the dark red is the very highest VMT neighborhoods, and the dark blue is the very lowest VMT neighborhoods. And you can see that same information. The height of each bar is the total amount of housing that was built in that decade, beginning pre-1940, where it's sort of everything that was built until 1940, and then ending in the final decade of 2011 to 2019. So what you see, particularly between the 2000s and the 2010s, the red, the high VMT development actually did decline by almost 60%. Unfortunately, it was not matched by an increase in development in the blue lower VMT areas. Instead, those areas, they increased as a proportion of development, but they absolutely went down. So we're just building much less housing overall. And of course, that's a national average. So what's really going on is this is playing out in metro areas all over the country. So I've kind of picked 4 example metro areas to be like our typologies. So the top left is Denver as an example of a kind of a typical growing metro area where they're adding a decent amount of housing in the latter decades, but it's predominantly in higher VMT areas. The top right is Charlotte, at the extreme end of that spectrum, where every decade from 1940 to 2010, they built more housing, but nearly all of it was in high VMT areas. Then the other end of the spectrum is New York City. And remember, this is the entire combined statistical area. So this is like a 4-state metro area, not just Manhattan. Nearly all of the housing in that metro by a national standard would count as very low VMT. The problem is it was all built before 1940, essentially, and then they stopped. Then finally, we have just a few places that have done a good job at continuing to keep up the pace of housing development while building most of that in lower VMT areas. So the example on the bottom right is Seattle. And you'll see in the forthcoming explainer blog, we'll have a top 5 kind of award for including Portland, Salt Lake City, El Paso, and Miami. So coming back now to California, that we don't, I'm showing this, we don't really learn much more than the line chart. The pattern when we look by decade was pretty similar in California to the US as a whole, other than the fact that kind of the starting point in 1940 is a little bit different. California overall, it doesn't have as much really rural areas as the US on average, but other than that, it's really kind of showing a lot of the same patterns. And if we look at a metro scale, kind of our two ends of the extreme. On one end, we have the Bay Area, where most of the housing has been built in lower VMT areas, but we see a drop-off in housing production really going back to the beginning in the 1980s. In contrast, in the Inland Empire, you see really high housing production, especially in the 80s and the 2000s, but most of that is in high VMT locations. Interestingly, you do still see the drop-off in the Inland Empire. So even there, you saw a big decline in the kind of development that we don't want to see from an environmental perspective, but again, without being balanced by environmentally good development. And we don't see any, if you look at kind of the major metros in California, none of them looks like Seattle to be in that top 5. So that leaves us with kind of our current predicament where we have yet to make really significant progress on both our state's transportation, carbon pollution targets and our housing production targets, which we need to, to restore affordability. We've passed over 100 state laws since 2016. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly how much the lack of progress you see on that chart is due to the laws kind of needing further reforms and how much is due to the really unfortunate timing of like all these laws coming into effect right when you hit the post-pandemic market headwinds. But I think, we can't count on the market to go back to the way it was in the next few years. So I think very likely you're going to see increased pressure for further reforms as Richard is going to talk about. We do, however, see some success stories that are worth elevating. One of them is accessory dwelling units. So, the accessory dwelling units, ADUs, were essentially negligible in their rate of production prior to 2017. And then we've had a sequence of state laws that's really helped put them on the map. And they're now consistently a fifth of all of the state's housing production, an even higher ratio in LA. And that was the result of not just 1 or 2 laws, but kind of the state legislature going back over and over again and saying, how can we really make sure that people wanting to build ADUs have the flexibility they need and, essentially removing obstacles that local governments were still placing in their way so that we could get these built. So I'll stop there.
Oh, wait, you get your one follow-up. All right.
Okay.
Reading between the lines, I'm going to ask you to cut to the chase. And thank you for saying you don't know the underlying reasons for the lack of progress given 100 new laws since 2016. And Natalie and Richard can speak to some of this. But here's the question. Room enough. If we were to, and let's not get into sort of the details of the composition of these lands, but if we were to set the policy, funding, and other drivers optimally, do we have room enough in lower VMT areas to accommodate our housing need in California? I could be Nancy Grace and say yes or no. No, you can be allowed.
I would bet yes. I don't fully have statewide data to prove that yet. We're actually working on researching that now. And this will come up maybe in another question too, where we have a project ongoing with the resources board to kind of look at some of these questions. I wish we had a statewide, integrated model of everything, where we'll be starting with kind of a case studies of a dozen or 24 California cities that are important for housing production.
Great, and we'll come back to that question. Thank you, Zach. That was... All right, Richard, you're on the hot seat.
So there we go. Well, thanks, Terry, for inviting me to be here. And hi, everyone. I want to correct, when Terry asked me to be on this panel, I was managing partner of Shoot Mahaly and Weinberger, but we've had a peaceful transition of power. And my law partner, Catherine Engberg, has taken over. So I had a good 9 years, not as many as Rachel Hooper, who was our managing partner before me for many years. But it's exciting because from my earliest days at Shoot Mahaly, I've been coming to this conference, and I started giving talks about general plans and the primacy of the general plan. And for law students who are here, and by the way, I was an undergrad at Davis, so go Aggies. If you've studied California land use and you have a textbook that was written more than 2 years ago, you've read that the general plan is the constitution for development. It is the most important underlying principle we have for planning. And it's what we were talking about in the Coastal Act. Planning, thinking ahead, thinking about the consequences of what we do and acting accordingly is a linchpin for what we do in California. When Terry called me to be on this panel, I had just given a talk about how general plans are irrelevant. The legislature has said, because of the housing crisis, and it is a crisis, we do not have housing that people can afford to live in and do their jobs. It's a serious problem. And the response has been to say, we are in it is like in an emergency, you focus on getting people out of harm's way. And so we've said in many instances, we are not looking at the general plan anymore. And so the challenge we have is, we heard in the coastal talk, we heard some great ideas from Liz. The challenge we have is, how do we fix this airplane as it is crashing? And that's what we have to do. And I think we need to be fighting at the state and national levels, but I'm going to be talking a lot about local level. And I just want to put, and again, this is my bias, and other people might have different assessments of the state election that we just had, but Proposition 5 would have made it easier to fund affordable housing. What did the voters of California say? No. Proposition 33 would have allowed local governments to experiment with different forms of rent control to protect low-income people. Wouldn't require it, would allow people to do it. What did the voters of California say? No. That was Prop 33. Prop 34, people may not have realized what they did, but Prop 34 took away the source of funding for the state's best statewide advocacy group for creative solutions for protecting affordable housing. In the Bay Area, we were all excited. We were going to have a regional measure to raise taxes to build affordable housing. The regional agency decided, we're not even going to put it on the ballot because we don't have a hope of winning. Nationwide, we had a presidential candidate say, my goal is to get 3 million new housing units, make housing a priority. when has housing been an issue in a presidential election? That speaks to the primacy of housing in people's minds, and also that apparently people didn't think that they wanted to vote for someone who had that as the number one priority. In addition, I mean, that was obviously a super complicated one. But so I think we have very strong headwinds in working for comprehensive statewide measures that promote thoughtful engagement. And so what that means is that we have to work at the local level. And that's actually a good thing, because guess what? These houses are built one house at a time or one multi-unit building at a time. And our landscapes, and I'm going to say working landscapes, and I mean working in the fullest sense, our ranch lands, our wild lands, our habitat, the lands that provide ecosystem services so that we don't have to spend as much money with physical infrastructure to take care of our things. All those are protected 1 acre at a time. The Nature Conservancy, we need to remember, they are this amazing organization that stewards lands all over the world, and they had a first conservation easement. They had a first acquisition, and then they had a second, and then they had a third. And we need to be working in each of our local communities to make to get the kind of housing we need and to get the kinds of local solutions like they're looking at in Western Riverside County to make things go. So I just want to highlight some of the tools so that when you go back to your community and you're talking to people, feel what gets you excited. We can't do everything. We can, especially now, there is no way for us all to fight against all the problems we're going to see. But we can be paying attention to what excites us most. And so I want to talk about some local housing solutions. And housing trusts, which is a very broad term, and lots of people can say, well, is it a housing trust? It is a community land trust. What I'm talking about is locally based organizations to promote the development and protection of affordable housing over the long term. Also including tools to get lower income people into that housing. Terry and I had the good fortune in Newport Beach to work with a group that I think many people would have called a model of NIMBYism for years, that partnered with locals developers to create a Newport Beach housing trust. In another case, we did a settlement where we created a nonprofit that included our conservation clients and the developers. And the developers agreed that every time a house in their 800-unit development sold, 1% of the purchase price would go to this nonprofit. Half the money would be used for habitat acquisition, a quarter would be used for habitat restoration, and a quarter would be used for workforce housing. Since 2010, they've brought in $30 million. They've given one of their most successful, they've given grants to low-income housing projects that enabled them to get the local funding they need to qualify for state and federal tax credits, bringing affordable housing into the Truckee-Tahoe area. They've also given deferred interest loans to first-time home buyers. So you get this loan, you don't have to pay it back till you sell the house, at which point, and it's at a very low interest rate or a shared appreciation rate. So there's a way where, and so that's 100 people have gotten those loans. But guess what? That's 100 people in the Tahoe Truckee area where housing for the people who work there is near impossible to find. The Sustainable Economies Law Center in Oakland go look at their website. They are doing amazing work looking at new ways of ownership, new ways of structuring housing trusts, community land trusts. They are saying, oh, this collective wants to own a piece of property, and they're realizing that state law hasn't contemplated any sort of collective cooperative ownership. Not because state law thinks it's bad, but because state law was drafted with a particular market orientation in the 1920s. And they're saying, why does the law need to be this way? How would it hurt to allow people to collaborate in this collective way? And they're helping make those changes. So they're both working with local groups and working at the state level to find ways to make these things happen. There's, yeah, I could talk forever and ever on that. Land trusts, not housing trusts, but land trusts that we think of as holding conservation easements, they are increasingly realizing that to protect the working landscapes that they care about, there needs to be the workforce engaged with those lands needs to be able to live and work in the area. And they are beginning to look at housing issues. My partner, Gabe Ross, is working to create a land trust housing forum that you'll probably be hearing more about in the months to come. If you want more information, check in with me after. I can give you his contact information. But they're already, the Kestrel Land Trust in Massachusetts has just collaborated to create a housing site with socially equitable access to open space, 42 acres of preservation, 11 acres for housing, bringing it together. So it's 90 units, but again, it's those first 90 units in that one community. And then what about 90 units in the next community and 90 units in the next community that are truly affordable? In the Hudson River Valley, a local land trust helped engineer a project where the local town used a tax that they had adopted earlier, similar to the voluntary fee that we came up with in the Martis Valley, where the community on properties that sold over a certain value, the city collects a percentage. They've used that to buy land that's going to be made available for affordable housing. The Nature Conservancy has just been in the news. In Point Reyes Station, or in the Point Reyes National Seashore, a litigation between conservation groups and ranchers and the Park Service has ended with a settlement. The ranchers are leaving their lands, the ranch lands, and their Nature Conservancy is going to help restore those lands. But as a key part of that deal, the Nature Conservancy is also helping to make sure that there is housing for the farm workers who had been living on those lands. And I suspect in many instances, those farm workers will end up in better quality housing at the end of it than they have been before. So my message to you is, while you're looking at what we need to do and getting the elected officials we need elected at the state level, also look at the local level. Talk to your neighbors, talk to your local elected officials, engage in your city council meetings. I was listening to Ann Applebaum, who's a student of autocracy around the world, and she was asked, what can we in America do in the face of growing autocratic tendencies? And she said, build connections in your neighborhood, build resilient communities with your friends. It is only through knowing our neighbors, know everybody on your block, say hi to them in the cafe, ask them what they're interested in, ask them what we want to be working on to make our community great, and make housing part of that, and make protecting natural landscapes part of that. I think that will not only help us with housing, but it will provide all kinds of great co-benefits to help us deal with what is to come. So.
Okay, Richard, you're not off the hook.
Okay.
All right, you have a magic wand. You need to aim it at Natalie, who's next. What would be the one thing the state could do to help make easier, faster, better, the kind of local work that you've just described?
So Terry did not prepare me for this question. I think the working with local governments as I do, I think if the state had a slush fund with a very high degree of flexibility in how they spend the money, that they can very quickly make grants to local governments. So a land trust comes to the city, says, we want to partner with you. The state says, here's $10,000 to help make that happen. I have a client that I got an email from them. They had a contract coming in from the Department of Energy. And I was just devastated because I knew this federal contract was going to be 40 pages long. And I was going to have to go through and I was going to have to tell them, well, there's nothing illegal about this, but you're going to need 5 different people to supervise and do this, 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 and this. And then I read it. And it was 2 pages. And the Department of Energy called it an award. They had come up with a system. They did not make it a government contract. They made it an award that had none of those rules. And it was for $50,000, which in the federal government scheme of things is no money at all. So if my client absconded with that money, wasted it horribly, if 20% of the recipients of those awards did that, it would be far less money than having lawyers review 40-page contracts. So I think the state could have small grants with low bureaucracy to make them happen.
Fantastic. By the way, the Newport Beach Housing Fund
Oh,
was
excuse me.
approved by the Secretary of State last Monday.
Excellent.
Actually, on the 20th, Martin Luther King's Month. Natalie, bring us home, and then we'll have some interaction.
Thanks, Terry. This is quite the full circle moment from me because I got my start as an intern at PCL working with Terry back in 2011 on high-speed rail policy. And now I got to stand up here as a panelist and tell you about the future of planning, which is pretty exciting. When we arranged this panel, they said I was going to go last and I was going to be the one to provide hope. And it was not lost on me the irony of being the government person here to provide hope for all of you, but I'm going to try my best. The office that I work for, as you heard, just underwent a name transition, but we've been around since 1970 as the Office of Planning and Research. And this last summer, we're renamed the Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation, or LCI, or Lucy, if you're still holding on to Lucy. And we're a little bit different than other government entities. We've always really been focused on predicting what's next, what's on the horizon. We're long-range planners, so that's what we have to do. And I really appreciate Liz mentioning the 1978 Urban Strategy, our first environmental goals and policy report. You can still find that on our website. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. It still feels very relevant today. It talks about a lot of the things we're talking about on this panel, that you should direct your development more towards urban areas, that you shouldn't sprawl. And we've often joked we could probably change a couple words, recirculate it, and no one would notice that it was written in 1978. But that is the good thing, right? Like, we're supposed to be years ahead. And I often complain that a lot of policy work is, wouldn't it be nice if 30 years ago we had done blah, 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 right? It's really easy to look backwards and have hindsight. It's really hard to have foresight and predict what's coming out 30 years from now. But in long-range planning, we all have to be futurists. We have to be thinking about what's on the horizon. If you're not currently a futurist, you can at least attend this amazing lunch session with Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a futurist, and take notes. And think about things like, for 30 years from now, are we going to be going into an office? Is that office going to be located in a downtown area? What is the climate going to be like? What is the economy going to be like? Are we still going to have a globalized supply chain that necessitates large warehouses and large ports and trucking routes? Or are we going to have small businesses again? These are all things we have to think about when we think about long-range planning and what 30 years from now is really going to look like. Certainly, we would be in a different position now if we had followed that 1978 urban strategy and built differently. But as you heard from the other panelists, that isn't really what happened. But one thing that I like to emphasize is that this is not a new way of developing. You heard from Zach that, pre-1940, this is how we developed all of our communities, to be walkable, to have the densities that supported public transit. So we're not pitching something new so much as a return to traditional development patterns that humans successfully used for a very long time, and that we know can be in harmony with the natural world, and also build community and provide sufficient housing and opportunities for small local businesses and things like that. Since the panelists have already done a really great job talking about that, I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, which is this other idea that you saw in the description, which is how do we live more in harmony with nature, and how do we build our communities to be more in harmony with nature? And this is another thing that is not new. It is something that humans have been doing since time immemorial in indigenous communities around the world. And we have indigenous communities here in California that found ways to live in harmony with this land and learned how to use this land in ways that was reciprocal, that created natural abundance. So I think it needs to be emphasized that part of the solution is talking to those people about those solutions. You see it now with an emphasis on what we call nature-based solutions, but a lot of that is really based on traditional ecological knowledge. And part of that also has to be land back. So we can't just go to the indigenous people and say, give us all of your secrets, we're sorry about the genocide, but now we need all of your information, right? Obviously that is inappropriate. And I wanna say that this has been a priority for the administration. So Governor Newsom has directed state agencies to find where they have excess land that they could give back to tribal nations. And I know the Nature Conservancy has also been doing a lot of work in this area, and it needs to be emphasized that that's part of the solution, is returning the land to its original caretakers for regeneration and restoration activities. So that is something I think we can all agree on, that we need to be regenerating land as much as possible and as quickly as possible. That's something that gives me a lot of hope in this moment. We actually have an LCI and Friends book club that meets every other Thursday, and we're reading The Reindeer Chronicles by Judith Schwartz. If you are not familiar with this book, it's phenomenal. It covers large-scale land restoration projects all across the world, and it is so inspiring and so hopeful because you see land that's been completely degraded turned into a thriving, healthy ecosystem in 15 years. In 15 years, we are often just planning to plan and litigating each other. But if we actually put shovels in the ground, we could regenerate land in 15 years. Like, that is so inspiring. And what Judith emphasizes in the book is, often these are people problems. We know what needs to be done. We have the tools, we have the science, we have the information. It's just getting people to redirect their energy and attention to actually doing the work. And it is healing and nourishing work. Something we joke a lot about in our office is how much we wish, instead of typing at computers, we could at least spend one day outside, right? If you took all of the state workers and gave them Friday to go plant trees, I think we'd make a lot of progress really quickly. So we're open to it. Direct us to do it. We would be happy to. And so the other thing I want to emphasize on that is we often forget that we are nature. Humans are nature too. There is kind of this dualism that was created where it's like nature is out there and we have to protect nature from ourselves, and we're just going to cluster over here and degrade everything that we touch. So I really think the future of planning, the future of land use is getting back to that understanding that we are nature, and that there are ways that we can interact with and inhabit the land that are restorative. We don't have to destroy everything we touch. We don't have to pave it. One thing we've been spending a lot of time looking into in our office is, what does this regenerative thinking look like in the built environment? Because there is a lot of emphasis on our natural and working lands and the restoration and regeneration that can happen there, but most of us do live in a more built environment. So how do we bring that thinking and that science and that wisdom to our built environment to cut down on the amount of gray and bring back more green, to bring back more biodiversity? We've heard from speakers who are putting regenerative rooftop gardens in urban areas and just bringing in pollinators and biodiversity in places that we normally wouldn't think of in a rooftop space. It is completely possible to grow food for the people who live in that building on the roof of that building if we are a little bit more creative in how we design our projects. In general, I think we need to be preparing for more localized lives. I agree with Richard that the future is is local, especially given national politics. This is where we're going to see the biggest impact. And no matter what the future holds, it is helpful to have those localized networks, to have local self-sufficiency, to be thinking about food security, and having more localized food sources. And in terms of what we're doing in that space, we are updating our general plan guidelines. So can debate how effective general plans are, if they're still, the constitution for local government, but we really see an opportunity in updating the general plan guidelines to show what's still possible in those documents and in local planning, especially bringing in this more nature-based and indigenous wisdom-focused planning, and what does that look like at the local scale. We're also really interested in bioregional planning, which is something that hippies talked a lot about in the 60s, and then it kind of died out for a bit. I'm bringing it back. So you'll hear more about that, and that's essentially getting folks together at the bioregional scale to think about how resources are used. And the bioregion is the place where you live, where also everything that you need to live is located. So, sometimes it's based on the watershed, sometimes it's a little bit larger than a single watershed, but really getting folks to know more about their bioregion and the assets that are available there, and how to effectively plan at that scale. And one of the things we're doing in that regard is we're holding bioregional roundtables around the state over the next year. And what really excites me about them is we're partnering with the Possibility Lab at UC Berkeley, who are experts in deliberative democracy, and actually bringing deliberative democracy tools to these events. So it's not just us coming to talk at the folks in the region or giving the folks in the region an opportunity to vent at us, although there will be that, because we know when the state shows up, usually there's a lot of things people want to tell us about, but also giving an opportunity to shape policies. And for those that don't know, deliberative democracy is really focused on consensus building, on finding where there is consensus with the group, and then we'll be able to elevate that consensus back up to state decision makers and say, we went out, we spoke to people in the regions, and they really want these policies changed. And to Richard's point, changing our funding programs is something we hear a lot, and it is on our radar. We're working with Angie Hacker at CivicWell, who wrote the Better Funding Report. I highly recommend you take a look at that if you haven't already. And Angie is advocating for something very similar to what Richard mentioned, which is more flexible funding, and then also a better way of tracking the projects that are needed at the local level. So right now, folks put a lot of time and energy developing a grant application. They submit their grant application to the state, and they're either awarded or they're not. And if they're not, it just kind of disappears, right? So instead, can we have a list of projects that we can pull from when we have state funding, that we can help connect to federal funding, that we connect with CEQA mitigation, with innovative financing solutions, or even what we saw with the SB 27 project registry was helping to connect these projects to businesses in California who've made net zero commitments and say, fund California projects. We love that you want to be net zero, but instead of buying offsets from the Everglades or the Amazon, there's projects right here in California that need that funding, and we can show you where they are and the impact that they would have. So kind of an all of the above approach, but really having that understanding of what are the most impactful projects at the local level that need funding, and how can we as the state better connect them to the available funding resources. So I am a CEQA attorney by trade, so I feel like I have to talk about CEQA for a bit. I think Richard would say it's also not the tool it once was, like general plans, but one of the things our office does is we are the ones that draft the initial CEQA guidelines and all of the technical advisories on CEQA. And to me, I think one of the reasons that folks have generally looked at exemptions and streamlining and shortcuts is that, to be honest, our office hasn't done a great job of keeping up with the times when it comes to CEQA. We were an office of all appointed people for most of the last 55 years, but just recently we became civil service. And so what that means is we're now going to have dedicated staff that withstand administration changes and administration priorities. And so I'm building out a dedicated CEQA team that can really be thinking about CEQA all the time, regardless of who is the governor of California. And one thing that we're looking into is true modernization of CEQA. That's not code for gutting CEQA, but acknowledging that it's not 1970 anymore, and we do have new tools available to us. We've been taking some meetings with the Danish government, who are doing some really innovative things with modern technology, where they're actually looking at their previous environmental documents and using AI to better understand and predict what environmental impacts might happen from future projects based on the information they already know. I was telling some folks at the League of Cities about this yesterday, and a lovely woman from Coachella was like, but what about all the environmental impacts of AI? So I will beat you to the punch. We know that. We are not unaware of the fact that AI has many downsides. But I do think there are certain tasks that can't be done by a human. And for us at OPR, LCI, we have the State Clearinghouse, which is a repository for all of the environmental documents that have been prepared in the state. This is, I would say, millions of pages. No one has ever tabulated it, but it is more information than a human brain can store. But this is a task that AI is really great at, as you can feed these large quantity of information into one of these advanced learning systems and see what we already know about environmental impacts in the state, already know about land in the state, so that when we think about long-range planning, when we think about where to build and how to build, we can utilize that information that was so laboriously collected and so much money was spent creating these lengthy environmental documents, so they're not just useful for that one project, but can help inform future projects in the state as well. So we're looking into that at the moment. And I also think that tools like that can help us get to net positive projects. I think that is something that we need to be talking more about. For those that aren't CEQA practitioners, the goal is always to get back to baseline. Like, here's baseline, here's typically existing conditions, like, let's get back to baseline. But we all know that maintaining the baseline isn't really gonna get us where we need to go at this point. We need to be changing the trajectory and building more regeneratively and having a positive impact with each project that we build. I know that I will not be able to do that through sticks, so I'm looking into how we can do that through carrots and provide helpful tools. So as people are designing projects and working on planning documents, they can see the impacts, and if they get to that net positive range, then maybe that's what qualifies them to be on this project list, where then they're connected with all of these various funding sources. So thinking about things like that. Also looking into how we can better utilize the common sense exemption that already exists in the CEQA guidelines. Be curious to hear for the CEQA practitioners in the room and Richard thoughts on this, but I think if a project was net positive for the environment, that it might be common sense that it wouldn't have a negative impact on the environment, but happy to have that conversation. And also looking into public banks. So for those that don't know, Governor Newsom signed two pieces of legislation in 2019 and 2021 that authorize public banks in California, and there are efforts to create those in different regions, and this allows money in the local community to stay in the community, and it can be easier for local projects to access money from public banks. So instead of it going off to national or international bank that then have their own priorities in terms of lending, it stays in the community and kind of recirculates there. So we're looking into how we can help further that effort as well. So altogether, this gives me hope. I hope it gave you some hope too. And I think if we're all on the same page and rowing together, we can really get where we need to be.
Okay, you're still on the hook.
I
I'm gonna warm
assumed.
up the, okay. You're welcome to answer this here or sit down, all right?
Okay.
So, all right, that was overwhelming and hopeful. And I was taking notes and learned a few things I want to follow up with you about.
Great.
I hope you did as well. But, Natalie, it's so complicated.
Oh, yeah.
How do we really measure progress? And I'm wondering if there might be something in just a simple metric like acres paved, acres saved.
Acres saved.
Go for it.
Thank you, Terry.
And then Liz, you're next.
Yeah, and I
We're
would
gonna let you have that.
curious others' thoughts. So, one of my pet peeves is how complicated it all is, and I tend to be an oversimplifier. But these are the metrics that make sense to me in terms of what we should be shooting for right now. And that is looking at the acreage that we have that has thriving ecosystem on it and making that number go up. Seems fairly straightforward and necessary. The other one may be a little more complicated, but you've heard a lot today about the impact that vehicle miles travel have on our environment and our communities. We've done a lot to study them. We're finding it's kind of like the Housing Accountability Act. There's always someone that's going to find a loophole. So one thing I am thinking a lot about is, can we just see how much acres or how many acres in our regions are we currently dedicating to cars through roads, through parking lots, through garages, and can we make that number go down? That's it, just make the number go down. And that means, taking a parking lot and putting an affordable housing project on it. Means taking a roadway and putting on a road diet so you have bike lanes and bigger sidewalks. Makes taking a freeway and turning it into a boulevard. There's lots of positive impacts, I think, that come from really utilizing that metric. So that
You made the fireworks go. All right, I have some other questions for the panel, but I'm gonna open it up. I'm gonna open it up for questions, but okay, Jordan, do you wanna throw the first question?
I don't. I really
You
don't.
don't? You really
I
don't?
would rather someone else. throw
All
it.
right, then I'm gonna come back to you because it's a good one and Richard's ready. All right,
So I have one sort of factoid.
okay,
one
and
serious
if people
question.
can't hear, we can restate the questions, but you speak up.
I can project. Factoid is that Ron Bass at OPR wanted to have a list of potential projects and mitigation measures that we could use, and so here we are.
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, Ron Bass was a long time ago, it was one of the original stuff people. My question, because I live in Solano County, I'm extremely sensitive to the influence of wealth. And there's a gap in wealth which drives a lot of the problem with land use and affordable housing. But in Solano, it's a particularly dangerous situation, and we have extremely valuable rangelands and grasslands and grain fields, as well as habitat. And the potential for them to wipe that out is extreme, in addition to the fact that we have an Air Force base that won't be able to fly over those units and will move. So what do you do with that kind of power, which we're experiencing at the federal level, at the local level? Because you said we could solve this at the local level.
Oh, well, Richard's been thinking about this because Jordan's not asked questions, so
Well,
do you
I
wanna
guess
kick us off?
My first thing is, first off, bravo to the people of Solano County, because the wealth has not done what the wealth said it was going to do. And I think that's because in Solano County, the Orderly Growth Committee and other groups have been working for generations.
And Richard, does everybody in the room know about the Solano County, California Forever? Okay. Richard.
So in Solano, and I'm gonna try to be general enough that I don't say anything specific wrong, but a number of years ago, people started noticing that a lot of land was being bought up. And I think it was the Wall Street Journal that did an investigation trying to figure out, why is all this land next to a United States Air Force base being bought up? And there were people in Congress who thought maybe it was the Chinese government buying this land up, and it turned out no, it was being bought up by a limited liability company with investors from all the luminaries of Silicon Valley to build a brand new town. Now Fairfield had undeveloped sites where they said, please, somebody come develop these sites. We have permits ready to go because we're trying to, but no, this group wanted to build a new town between Fairfield and Sassoon City, if I've got my map right, near Rio Vista. And by the way, we're also suing people who were refusing to sell to them. And so this all got revealed. They had to tell us about their plan earlier, but because of local thinking in Solano County, there is an initiative in the general plan that says, what is urban shall be municipal. So urban uses should be in cities. And if you want to do urban uses in the county, you need a vote of the people of the county. And that's a policy that the Orderly Growth Committee adopted, I think in the 80s. I'm looking, yeah. And it was one of the first initiatives that our law firm got to work on, and the people of Solano County have renewed it over the years. And it is because of that local action that this group said, oh, we're going to get that voter approval, no problem. But community organized, community started asking questions, no suitable answers were provided, and the group stepped back. Now, they haven't gone away, and your question is, how do we keep fighting against that? And my answer is, what you've been doing is great, and while the laws are not as great as they used to be, there still are laws, and I think it is that local action that's really going to make a difference.
Other suggestions or comments? Zach?
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Yeah.
I think we do have to keep the housing supply and demand in mind. So there's two sides of the equation, and that effort is responding to an unmet demand, and maybe responding in a way that we in this room are not happy about. But I think in order to reduce the kind of market pressure for things like that to continue to happen, we just need to make a lot more progress. It's great that it's a separate conversation about why stuff's not being built where they want it to be built in Fairfield. I actually don't know all of the details on that. I've been hearing that kind of over the last year, but certainly in the core Bay Area, I know that there are a lot of despite those 100 laws, there's a lot of single-family zoning, or essentially single-family zoning left, even in San Francisco, right next to jobs and opportunities that we have not yet said it's okay to build an apartment on.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please.
So Solano County builds more houses and has met its RENA numbers consistently. I don't care for the pattern of land use, but that's a fact. That Vallejo and Fairfield in particular were saying build here because there are some jobs and they need housing and they need the income. And what this new 400,000 proposed town without a government, understand that it's not a city, they would take what limited resources are away from that Vallejo and Fairfield. I'm not going to mention my very own city of which I was a mayor, but that is the impact that it has to all of us who are trying to do the right thing with housing.
Good, thank you, Elizabeth.
Tara, can I just,
Oh, yeah, Liz, please, weigh in.
Jordan, is it okay? I just wanna, so I really am very thankful of organizations like Greenbelt Alliance and Solano Land Trust and others who really dug deep in the face of a lot of wealth coming at them, and it still is there. And what I really appreciate what Solano put together is the kind of counter, you probably have been involved in this, is not just saying no,
Right.
but is also saying, let's imagine what Solano County could be. And not just stopping with no. And I think that's what gives me hope, right? And what Natalie, just like this, what is this net positive benefit instead of creating a new city in the middle of nowhere that would cost the county, hundreds of millions of dollars and erode values that people care about, and, override a very good county policy that I would like to see everywhere. What's that next step? And so I think that is really, again, thankful to Greenbelt Alliance, Solano Land Trust, and the local elected officials who have really tried to take that next step. So, and that's, I think, what gets to this local, at the ground, tapping into that creativity and that, emotion and that focus.
Because as Liz says, it's so frustrating to all of us who've been working hard in California for decades for smarter, more regenerative planning and outcomes, to see a county that's been a model, both from the standpoint of their general plan and their citizen action and voter action, their land trust, their housing trust, be on the front lines of having it all taken away. So, Elizabeth, you have friends, I'm sure, in the room. We'll talk more about this. Yes, I think you're next.
Yes, first of all, thank you all for the wonderful work you're doing. It's very heartening as a planner to see other planners that work in this way. I particularly want to tee up a question, though, for the Nature Conservancy. Several years ago, I was involved in a program that you were doing that was giving grants of $5,000 to churches, predominantly Black churches. And it was miraculous in terms of its impact. And particularly in light of Martin Luther King's comment about if you want to go somewhere, go together. In the Black community, the way you go together is through the church. And I was just wondering, are you guys still doing that? And would you do more to publicize that? Because I know it's worked in Chicago and a number of other places, and it's just outstanding.
Is that here in California, or I'm not aware of this?
I specifically was connected with it in Chicago, St. Louis, and a few other places. But if you're not aware of it, I'll just add it to your whatever.
Can you find out more about it and let us know, and we'll chase it down.
Yeah, I can, and just give me your contact information.
Particularly with the change of heart of our federal government, this kind of small grant program could make a real difference.
It is a miraculous program, too. I can see how it, the churches were creating green spaces right behind the churches. And $5,000 is not a lot of money for some programs, but $5,000 was a miraculous change.
Well, and now we have legislation to allow churches also to more easily provide for housing on their excess sites. So there could be a sort of duality here that speaks to some of the things, you've recommended. Let's see, you're next, and then we'll go to the back.
With the planning aspect of sort of incorporating industry within and keeping sort of communities that just have continued to be put outside the bounds of these areas. I'm wondering with new technologies, sort of like lithium recycling, and as we move towards a more renewable future, things we'll have to do along the way to sort of make sure we don't hamper ourselves. Those seem to be historically treated like factories or landfills, things that are polluting.
Industrial.
And so I'm wondering how you sort of marry the concept of having that not be put outside, but also making sure it's safe for those within the community.
It's a great question, and we danced around the idea of bringing sort of the transition to clean energy, which, by the way, includes a lot of very industrialized uses, as you mentioned, mining, but also hydrogen plants, right? Industrial. Liz, do you want to talk about that? Just a little bit, the Nature Conservancy's mapping work is also showing a way to lower conflict lands for those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's just basic in the planning aspect, and so much of what we've identified, what we collectively identified as a problem, but also collectively identified as a need for solutions and have tried, is these siloed sectors of planning, right? So you can have a transportation planner that just plans transportation. You can have an energy planner that just plans for energy. You can have a conservation planner that just plans for conservation. What we're trying to do is bring it all together. And if you look at these values and these sectors at a landscape scale, you start to see things that might be revealed as kind of aha moments. So for example, we've done a lot of planning for renewable energy and conservation and biodiversity in areas where there's been sort of a rush for a land grab. So in the Mojave Desert, in the Central Valley, looking at the drivers of energy production, primarily not just locations for large-scale solar, but also transmission, and how transmission drives a lot of the placement and also the delivery of that renewable energy to the communities that need them. Where can we look at part of the landscape that says this is really high biodiversity, and let's keep that as biodiversity? And where are there places where there is less biodiversity, maybe already disturbed, and areas where there are existing communities? And let's start to plan the transmission lines so that we support this idea of land and production for our needed goals, and land that could be preserved and enhanced with that idea, Natalie, of net positive for biodiversity and land and water. And so I think what you're talking about, though, is not this landscape scale, if I understand it correctly, but more like kind of within the urban context, right?
Yeah, sort of, if you have this plan, you have this sort of dangerous, not sort of dangerous, but more pollutive place, are you gonna put sort of buffer zones or areas around single-family housing, spring up right next to it, sort of new age fence application?
What are the criteria for safely developing these industrial uses?
I'll just finish and then go to others, but something that we've been working on and that exists in California and actually around the world are called green prints. And it was, it kind of was born out of the Sacramento area blueprint, which I'm looking at our leader there. But it didn't really effectively incorporate the nature aspect. So if you look at the Bay Area Green Print, which is free and you can just look it up and explore, we've integrated nature, but we've also integrated transportation. We've integrated, bike paths. We've integrated the priority development areas. And you can start, and even pollution corridors and equity needs and climate resilience. And it's kind of been built up over time, so you can look at this together. So you can say, hey, that looks like a good place where we can put some kind of industrial facility. But let me look at, from an equity or an environmental justice perspective, are there communities that are in that area that will be negatively impacted? I want to turn on that pollution corridor lens or something. So I do think that this idea of green printing or blueprinting or community landscape scale mapping and data is really important, and it has to get to where we can make these trade-offs and these decisions that are much better than just kind of going blind because somebody owns a piece of land and it's for sale and let's just go there.
And of course, mining is its own challenge because the resource exists where it exists. Zach?
Yeah, so I want to answer the question in a slightly different way and remind us that the whole scale of the clean energy, mining and materials required is a function of our urban systems. And this is why I think it's particularly problematic when where we only think about CO2 in kind of short-term CO2 as our metric, and have people propose, we can just switch to electric vehicles and then we don't have to worry about sprawl. There's actually a great report from UC Davis. Alyssa Kendall is one of the lead authors. I've never met, but her name pops up, and it's in partnership with a climate and community project called Achieving Zero Emissions with More Mobility and Less Mining. And they map out 2050 scenarios of how many hundreds of thousands of tons of lithium will be needed each year to kind of maintain the US transportation system. Precondition on all of their scenarios are zero carbon or zero tailpipe emissions. But if you do less, if you have less cars and you have smaller vehicles, you have battery recycling, you have more urban density, you can actually reduce, in their estimate, the amount of lithium that you would need by 90%.
Sounds like a good report to look at. Did you get that, Zach?
We gave people a
The first part, what was the?
Name the report again, Zach.
It's called Achieving Zero Emissions with More Mobility and Less Mining.
Cool.
The lead author is Tea Rio-Francos.
Yeah, no, it speaks to the complexity of landing all of this as best as we can with regenerative land use in mind. It's not gonna be easy.
Terry,
Trade-offs.
can I just
Yeah,
jump in?
Richard.
Just
Yeah.
quickly to, first off, the next panel in this sequence that will be here after lunch is going to be talking about this. So
Yeah.
I don't know exactly what they're going to be saying, but I'm excited to come hear
Yep.
what they say about how we move forward with this.
Yep.
And I just want to underline Liz's point about equity considerations. I'm struck, I have a lot of friends who live near Moss Landing where there is a battery storage plant on fire. And they're talking about how bad it is and all the impact it's gonna have. And I feel for them. And I'm aware that there are people up and down this state who have been living for generations in the shadow of petroleum refinery plants. And so we should not be making anything worse, but we need to make sure that the new things we do, we are designing in a more equitable way.
Absolutely, and I would say we've tried to do that. There are some facts emerging about this maybe being Vistra 1, it may be being older technology, but stand by, because we need to really understand this, because we need batteries, so we're going to have to do this better, smarter, etc. Okay, yes, back row.
Hi, my name is Jennifer, and I work with a lot of nonprofits across the spectrum in Sacramento, pushing for various policies in contracting. So Natalie, I actually was seizing and thinking about where there's a lot of intersectionality across all kinds of entities seeking to be, or basically relied upon by the state and local governments to be partners in achieving the state's objectives. And I in fact was reading an article from October, late payments to nonprofits hamper Californians' fight against homelessness. And so much of what you're talking about, like big tweaks are great, but little tweaks could make a really big difference. And I was thinking yesterday, listening to the Prop 4, the climate bond implementation, there's an opportunity with the climate bond to really model, like use that opportunity to really aggressively attack in, true indirect costs, really the short form payment, the short form contracts, et cetera. I'm just curious, I will tell you that our governor and our administration, they're not a great partner in the policy conversations here, and the governor has vetoed numerous bills that would improve contracting processes for nonprofits. I am curious from you, Natalie, who can we work with? Who can we work with in state government? Be a voice to the, to help identify the real challenges on the government side to these changes, and how do we find an interested partner?
I think we just recruited somebody to talk to Angie too. So
Yeah.
Natalie can be your conduit, but say a little bit more about her effort.
So Angie Hacker from CivicWell wrote the Better Funding Report, and it includes that bigger idea of the unified project list, but it also includes small tweaks that would make a difference, and this is based on her 15 years of experience working with communities as a TA provider. But I would say another great outlet and an entity that's part of our umbrella that does a lot of work on SGC, Hampton, Daryl Steinberg Creation SGC.
Thank you.
It's amazing, it's perfect, and it's a great partner. And SGC is really talking with the administration about how do we make the Prop 4 funding better and utilize them as an entity to provide better TA and some of the more innovative things that they've done.
Read that report's amazing, SGC is amazing, and yet so I will follow up with
And then I will also say, come to the regional roundtable.
Yes.
When we have it in your area, there will be an opportunity to talk about the policy changes that you want to see. And then, the policy changes that have consensus, which we expect will include a lot about, better ways of distributing funding and better contracting mechanisms. Those will get elevated up to the Strategic Growth Council. So.
I doubt that it is on his radar, but the Attorney General, who is responsible for legal risk management for the state of California, is going to be here at lunch. And you might ask him what his office can do to help reframe the way they think about, it is really easy for me as an attorney to tell my clients how to reduce risk, and it is always by adding more words to the contract. But my clients, my clients who are entrepreneurial push back and say, no, I'm willing to take that risk. And tell me, how can I do the contract so that I have 10% more risk? And I help them with that. So maybe his lawyers can tell their clients, if you would like us to help write riskier contracts, we're happy to do that.
And the fact that the federal government is doing it through DOE should be another motivator.
Yeah.
If they can do it, we can recommend.
So, any wisdom, Mr. Steinberg, honorable, for what we could work towards in California, a policy lever that would make a difference.
I am Daryl Steinberg, and I was author of SB 375, 743, and Strategic Growth Council, a few other things, and I'm sorry for all the trouble that I caused.
No, thank you.
But okay.
We gave you some kudos earlier.
Well, I do think that 15 years after any good bill, I know these were perfect bills, not quite, are written, that it is time to take a fresh look about how to improve them. SB 375 and 743 together really were a vision around how to plan green print, how to plan regionally in ways that our land use, transportation, and housing patterns would be net contributors to improving the climate as opposed to the other way around. It was the product of political compromise back in its day. I called it the coalition of the impossible, to get the building industry, the environmental community, and local governments together on a bill. It was one of my, I think, most memorable negotiations.
Greatest achievements.
Thank you. It's one. It's in the top.
One of many.
It's one of the top. But anyways, but there were inherent problems. There was no funding attached to it, and redevelopment, and especially the housing piece went away. There was no funding to implement the plans. And then there was this continued fighting and inconsistency, which is legendary across many issues, between state and local government about who is in charge. And so I don't know that it has had all of the hardest carrots that I wanted it to have. It still does, 375. I also think there are reasonable developer complaints about the inconsistency of the VMT regulation and how that's implemented across. So I think there's an opportunity now to both strengthen these laws and at the same time provide some form of relief so that we get more of the kind of development that we all want to see. More infill, more clean energy. You know, this might be controversial in this setting, in this room, and but what the heck, I'm not in office. Really, 375 and 743 were attempts in even indirect ways at the right kind of CEQA reform. Because the idea was to eliminate the regulatory barriers for the kinds of development that we want to see more of that are consistent with a good environment and a clean environment. And that those tensions still remain. And so I think now is the time. I know you have legislators like Senator Cabaldon, who was one of the originators of the Sacramento blueprint that preceded SB 375. now in the Senate, and I think it's time to strengthen these laws to really imprint regional planning, but there may need to be some gives, so to speak, on the regulatory side a little bit in order to be able to modernize these laws in the right way. So I think it's a great time. It really is.
A perfect and hopeful close.
Yes.
And I'm so glad you joined us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.